I never thought my life would unravel with a phone call at 7 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to paint Albuquerque's sky in shades of amber when Stephen's voice crackled through my phone, urgent and breathless. "Another can't miss opportunity," he said. "Just $15,000 for a rare wine shipment from Napa Valley. The supplier needed the money before noon." "Of course, honey," I heard myself say, the words falling from my lips like muscle memory. After 30 years of marriage, I'd become fluent in the language of emergency transfers and last-minute financial rescues. My hands moved automatically to my laptop, ready to drain my savings one more time for the man I thought I couldn't live without. But fate has a peculiar way of opening your eyes when you least expect it. As I dialed Stephen back to confirm the account details, something strange happened. The call connected, but he hadn't properly hung up his end. Through the muffled background noise, I heard his voice again. Not the loving husband I knew, but a stranger wearing my husband's voice. "Babe, relax. The gullible one will wire the money in a couple of hours. With her, just say, urgent, and she caves." My fingers froze over the keyboard. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as a woman's laughter, bright, young, intimate, floated through the connection. "You're brilliant, honey. That's how we'll finally move to Madrid together." In that moment, 30 years of marriage crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity. Every late-night meeting, every emergency loan, every sacrificed dream. They weren't building our future. They were funding his escape with another woman. I, the devoted librarian who had spent decades keeping our ship afloat, was nothing more than an ATM with a wedding ring. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto my desk. Outside, the morning sun continued its climb, indifferent to the way my world had just imploded. 3 decades of trust and sacrifice reduced to ash by a careless moment of honesty. I sat there watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam cutting across my desk and felt something shift inside me. Not just heartbreak, but the first stirrings of something else. Something that felt dangerously like awakening. I looked down at my hands, these hands that had signed countless checks and transfer forms, that had patted Stephen's back reassuringly through 2 failed MBAs and a bankrupt restaurant. These same hands that had worked extra shifts at the library, filing books and helping students, while he chased dreams that always seemed to need just one more investment. The irony wasn't lost on me. A librarian who'd spent her life surrounded by stories had failed to read the most important one, her own. But as I sat there in my suddenly too quiet house, watching the morning light creep across my mortgage statements and credit card bills, I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a very different one. Looking back, I suppose I should have seen the warning signs. But when you're 54 and have already buried one husband, you learn to mistake red flags for rose-colored glasses. The truth is, I met Stephen when I was still raw from Jorge's death, still flinching at the empty side of my bed and the echo of my footsteps in a too-quiet house. I was 38 then, working the evening shift at Albuquerque's Central Library. The building was my sanctuary, all those stories bound in leather and cloth, waiting patiently on their shelves like old friends who never asked uncomfortable questions about moving on or dating again. Then Stephen walked in one Tuesday evening, looking for books on starting a business. He had this way of smiling that made his eyes crinkle at the corners, and he called me Miss, even after I told him I was a widow. "A beautiful mind like yours shouldn't be hidden behind these shelves forever," he said, leaning against my desk while I catalogued new arrivals. That should have been my first clue. The subtle way he suggested my chosen career wasn't enough. But his words felt like warmth after a long winter, and I was so tired of being cold. Our courtship was a whirlwind of dreams and promises. Stephen had big plans: tech startups, import businesses, revolutionary apps. Each idea sparkled brighter than the last, and he spoke about them with such conviction that I could almost see them materializing in the air between us. When he talked about our future, I felt my grief being replaced by something that felt like hope. The first time he asked for money, it was for a business course. Just $3,000 to invest in our dreams. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the one Jorge and I had bought at a yard sale when we were first married, writing out the check with hands that trembled slightly. Stephen kissed my forehead and called me his angel. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't investing in our dreams. I was financing his fantasies. The business course led to an MBA, then another. Each failure was cushioned by my savings, my extra shifts, my quiet acceptance. I refinanced my house, the house Jorge and I had bought with such pride, to fund Stephen's restaurant venture. "It's a sure thing," he said, his eyes bright with conviction. "This is our ticket to the good life." The restaurant failed before its first anniversary, but Stephen's optimism never wavered. He had a gift for making each setback sound like a stepping stone to something greater. And I had a gift for believing him, for seeing potential where there were only promises. Maybe because believing in him was easier than admitting I'd chosen wrong. Or maybe because the fear of being alone again was stronger than my financial common sense. My colleagues at the library would give me concerned looks when I mentioned Stephen's latest venture. Karen, my next-door neighbor, once gently suggested that perhaps I was carrying too much of the load. But I defended him fiercely. After all, wasn't that what love was about? Supporting your partner's dreams? I'd tell myself that Jorge would have wanted me to be happy, to help someone else achieve their potential. But Jorge had been different. He worked as a high school science teacher, grading papers late into the night and getting excited about his students' science fair projects. We'd lived modestly but contentedly, saving for retirement and splurging only on the occasional weekend trip to Santa Fe. With Jorge, love had felt like building something together, brick by steady brick. With Stephen, it felt like chasing mirages in the desert, always convinced the next oasis would be real. Now, sitting in my study with that devastating phone call still ringing in my ears, I finally understood the difference. Jorge had loved me for who I was. Stephen had loved me for what I could give him. And I, in my determination to not be alone, had confused generosity with love, sacrifice with partnership. With trembling hands, I pulled out the accordion file, where I kept all our financial records. Methodical as always, I had labeled everything by year, each tab a chapter in the story of my own undoing. Sitting cross-legged on the floor of my home office, I began to piece together a true cost of loving Stephen. The numbers told a story my heart had refused to see. In 2016, there was the sapphire ring I'd inherited from my mother, sold to cover the temporary cash flow problem at his consulting firm. I touched my empty ring finger, remembering how he'd promised to replace it as soon as things turn around. They never did. 2018, the refinanced mortgage papers, my signature, bold against the white paper, the equity I'd built with Jorge over 15 years of careful payments, dissolved to fund Stephen's restaurant dreams. "It's an investment in us," he'd said, his arm around my shoulders as we stood in front of the empty storefront. "Just think, in 5 years we'll be retired in Tuscany, drinking wine on our own vineyard. The restaurant lasted 8 months. The debt lasted much longer. 2020, canceled tickets to visit my sister in Boston. The timing's not right, sweetheart. I need to meet these investors. I found the receipt for a weekend in Santa Fe, dated the same time as my canceled trip. At the time, he'd said it was a business retreat. Now I wondered if Valerie had been there too, drinking the wine I'd paid for, sleeping in a bed funded by my overtime shifts. 2021, the second MBA program. This one's different, Rose. These connections will change everything. More student loans, more credit card debt, more promises of future prosperity. I had worked extra weekend shifts at the library, telling myself it was temporary, that soon we'd have the life he kept promising. The pattern was clear now, laid out in black and white before me. Every time I'd tried to save money, there was an emergency. Every time my account showed a healthy balance, there was an opportunity too good to miss. I'd been so focused on keeping us afloat that I hadn't noticed I was drowning. My hands shook as I tallied the total, $3,000 or $12,000. The number stared back at me, stark and accusing. $312,000, not including interest, not including the emotional cost, not including the dreams I'd put aside to fund his. But it wasn't just the money. It was the subtle way he'd undermined my confidence over the years. You're so good with numbers, Rose, but you don't understand business like I do. This is why you're still working in a library. You're afraid to take risks. Don't you trust me, after everything we've been through? Each manipulation was so subtle, wrapped in just enough truth to make me doubt myself. When I'd expressed concern about our mounting debt, he'd remind me of how lonely I'd been after Jorge died. When I suggested cutting back on expenses, he'd talk about all the years of happiness ahead of us, making me feel small and selfish for worrying about money. I found a credit card statement from last Christmas. He'd bought me a modest silver necklace. All we can afford right now, darling. While the same statement showed a $3,000 charge at a luxury boutique in Santa Fe. Was that for Valerie? Had she been wearing my sacrifices around her neck while laughing about the gullible one who made it all possible? The sun had climbed higher in the sky as I sat surrounded by these paper trails of betrayal. My back ached from sitting on the floor, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow feeling in my chest. Each statement, each receipt, each loan document was a thread in a tapestry of lies. Lies I'd helped weave with my own willful blindness. A memory surfaced. Last month, when I'd mentioned retiring next year, Stephen had smoothly suggested we wait. The market's not right, he'd said. Besides, you love your work. The truth hit me like a physical blow. He'd never intended for me to retire. I was more valuable to him working, earning, funding his real life with Valerie. Something strange happens when your world shatters. Time seems to move differently. That Tuesday morning stretched like hot glass, each moment crystallizing into perfect clarity. As I sat among the scattered financial records of my dismantled life, a peculiar calm settled over me. It wasn't the numb shock of before, but something else entirely, a cold, clear certainty. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting from hours on the floor, and walked to the bathroom mirror. The woman who stared back at me looked different somehow. Same silver-streaked hair I'd never bothered to dye because Stephen said he loved it natural. Same reading glasses perched on my nose, slightly smudged from handling all those papers. But her eyes, my eyes, held something new. Something that looked remarkably like freedom. Enough, I whispered to my reflection, testing the word on my tongue. Enough. The librarian in me had always loved systems, order, the quiet power of organized knowledge. Now, that same methodical mind began to work in a different direction. I opened my laptop and created a new document, titling it Home Renovation Projects. Innocent enough if Stephen happened to see it. But this wasn't about redecorating. This was about reconstruction. First, I listed every joint account, every credit card, every financial tie that bound us together. I noted down account numbers, balances, and most importantly, which ones had been opened in my name alone. The picture that emerged was both frightening and empowering. I had more separate assets than I'd realized, carefully maintained habits from my life with Jorge that Stephen had never quite managed to break. Next, I researched divorce lawyers, opening their websites in incognito mode. I wasn't ready to make that decision yet, but knowledge had always been my armor. I found myself drawn to Lisa Martinez's profile. Her specialty was helping women rebuild their financial independence after decades of marriage. I saved her number under Library Book Club in my contacts. The third document I created was harder, a timeline of truth. Every time Stephen had asked for money, every emergency transfer, every canceled vacation, and refinanced loan. But this time, I added notes about what was really happening, connecting dots I deliberately left unconnected before. The weekend business conferences that coincided with Valerie's Instagram posts from the same locations, the cash withdrawals that matched expensive restaurant charges in parts of town Stephen claimed he never visited. As I worked, a strange sense of power began to grow in my chest. Each revelation, each piece of evidence I gathered, felt like picking up a piece of myself I'd dropped along the way. The woman who'd carefully saved for retirement with Jorge. The librarian who could spot a fraudulent source at 20 paces. The Rose who had survived losing her first love and built a life from those ashes. I thought about Stephen's call this morning, his casual certainty that I would transfer the money. He'd been right about one thing. I had always caved when he said urgent, but he'd forgotten something crucial about librarians. We know that every story has a turning point, and we're very, very good at keeping secrets. My phone buzzed. Stephen, wondering about the transfer. I let it go to voicemail. Instead, I opened my banking app and looked at the balance he expected me to drain. $15,000. The exact amount of my recent bonus from the library, the one I hadn't told him about. For the first time in years, I smiled at a bank balance, remembering something my grandmother used to say. Sometimes the cheapest way to buy something is with money. I closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen. With deliberate care, I made myself a cup of the expensive Earl Grey tea I usually saved for special occasions. Standing at the window, watching the New Mexico sun paint the mountains in shades of promise, I took my first sip of what freedom tasted like. My phone buzzed, again and again. Stephen's voice messages would be getting increasingly anxious now. He'd be crafting careful explanations about why the wine dealer needed the money immediately, why this opportunity couldn't wait. But for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't listening. Instead, I was planning. Because here's the thing about librarians. We understand the power of silence. We know that the most important words in any story are often the ones left unspoken. And we're experts at playing the long game, at knowing exactly when to close one book and open another. They say the early bird catches the worm, but that Wednesday morning, I caught something far more valuable. My freedom. I was waiting outside Sunrise Bank when Gloria, the branch manager, arrived at 8:15 a.m. She'd known me for 20 years, had helped me deposit countless paychecks from those extra library shifts. Today, she'd help me do something far more important. Everything. Okay, Rose, she asked, noting my early arrival. The concern in her voice nearly cracked my composure, but I held firm. It will be, I replied, following her inside. I need to make some changes to my accounts. Over the next hour, I systematically dismantled every financial link between Stephen and myself. Joint checking account, closed, shared savings, transferred to a new account in my name only. Credit cards, cancelled every additional card he'd ever had access to. Gloria's fingers flew over her keyboard as I calmly listed each change I needed, her professional demeanor slipping only once. When I showed her the notes I'd made about the pattern of withdrawals, "Rose," she said softly, "I wish you'd come to us sooner." "I wish I'd come to myself sooner," I answered, and we shared a moment of understanding that needed no further words. By 9:30, I had a new account at a different branch, new cards on the way, and a quietly renewed sense of self. Stephen wouldn't discover any of this until he tried to make his next purchase. Probably something expensive for Valerie, I thought, with a strange detachment that surprised me. My next stop was Lisa Martinez's law office. I hadn't made an appointment, but something told me this couldn't wait. The universe seemed to agree. She'd had a cancellation that morning. As I sat in her office, surrounded by degrees and certifications, I felt an odd sense of déjà vu. How many times had I helped students research their legal papers, guiding them through databases of case law? Now here I was, becoming a case myself. "Tell me everything," Lisa said, sliding a legal pad across her desk. And I did. The failed businesses, the drained accounts, the mortgage refinanced without my full understanding of the terms. She took notes in quick, efficient strokes, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification. When I mentioned the phone call I'd overheard, her pen paused. "You have it recorded?" "No," I said, "but I have something better." I pulled out my meticulously organized timeline, complete with dates, amounts, and cross-referenced evidence. Her eyebrows rose as she flipped through the pages. "Most clients come to me in tears," she said. "You come with a research paper." I smiled slightly. 30 years of library science. Organization is my superpower. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out a strategy. Lisa explained my rights, the importance of documenting everything. I was already doing that, and the steps we'd need to take to protect my assets. When she mentioned filing for divorce, I felt a momentary flutter of panic, but it passed quickly, like removing a Band-Aid from an old wound. I realized the pain wasn't from the removal. It was from leaving it on too long. The last stop of my morning was the most personal. I drove to the bank where I kept my safe deposit box, the one Stephen didn't know about. Inside was the jewelry Jorge had given me, including his mother's pearls, which I'd moved there after. Stephen had started suggesting we liquidate assets for his ventures. I added my new account documents and a sealed envelope containing my timeline of Stephen's financial manipulation. Evidence secured, just as Lisa had advised. By noon, I'd fundamentally altered the landscape of my life, but from the outside, nothing looked different. I'd gone about my revolution quietly, methodically, the way I'd always done everything. Stephen's increasingly urgent texts about the wine investment went unanswered. Each buzz of my phone felt less like an obligation, and more like confirmation that I was doing the right thing. When I finally returned home, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the hall closet and pulled out my old record player, the one Jorge and I used to dance to on Sunday mornings. The vinyl crackled as Ella Fitzgerald's voice filled the room. I stood in my living room, swaying slightly to "I'm Beginning to See the Light," and realized I was smiling. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to ask anyone's permission to spend my own money. I didn't have to justify my choices or defend my concerns. The freedom felt dizzying, terrifying, and absolutely right. like reshelving books after they've been in the wrong section for too long. Everything was finally finding its proper place. The first sign that Stephen had discovered my financial rebellion came at 2:47 p.m. while I was carefully boxing up his expensive wines in the cellar. My phone erupted with the special ringtone I'd assigned him years ago. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, though the irony of its fate knocking at the door theme hadn't struck me until that moment. "Rose, there must be some mistake." His voice had that smoothly concerned tone he always used when trying to manage a situation. "My card was declined at the wine merchant's. Rather embarrassing, actually. Have you been having trouble with the bank?" I held the silence for 3 breaths, remembering Lisa's advice about staying calm and factual. "No trouble at all. I've simply closed our joint accounts." The pause that followed was so long, I could almost hear his mind racing, recalculating, trying to find the right angle to play this. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to wounded disbelief. "Darling, what's going on? This isn't like you." "No," I agreed, carefully wrapping another bottle in bubble wrap. "It's exactly like me, the real me, the one who's been here all along, watching and waiting and keeping receipts." "Receipts? Rose, you're not making sense. Let me come home. We'll talk about this." "I think you have a wine delivery to sort out first." I surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. "In Napa Valley, with Valerie." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me everything. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to that intimate whisper he used when trying to diffuse my rare moments of resistance. "Rose, whatever you think you heard, relationships are complicated. We can work through this. We always do." "No, Stephen. I always did. And I'm done." I ended the call and turned off my phone. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I looked at the wine bottles I'd been packing. Vintages he'd insisted on collecting, each one purchased with money that could have gone toward our mortgage. I picked up a 2015 Bordeaux he'd called an investment in our future and read its label carefully before placing it in the donation box for the library's annual fundraiser. The next few hours passed in a blur of methodical activity. I organized papers, shredded documents, and carefully documented everything of value in the house with my phone's camera, just as Lisa had advised. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors Jorge and I had installed together, now scuffed by years of Stephen's expensive Italian shoes. At 6:13 p.m., the doorbell rang. I knew it would be him. Stephen had always believed in confronting problems quickly, before people had time to make rash decisions. Through the peephole, I could see him shifting from foot to foot, his usual confident posture slightly wilted. I didn't open the door. "Rose?" His voice came through muffled but clear. "Your car's here. I know you're home. We need to talk about this like adults." I sat down on the stairs, watching the door's shadow stretch across the entryway floor. From this angle, I could see the slight gap under the door, his shoes moving back and forth as he waited. "Think about what you're throwing away," he continued, his tone shifting to something harder. 30 years, Rose. 30 years of building a life together. Are you really going to let one misunderstanding destroy everything? I almost laughed at that. One misunderstanding. As if the hundreds of thousands of dollars, the lies, the secret girlfriend, the years of manipulation could be swept away with a single word. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened my Kindle app, starting the new mystery novel I'd been wanting to read. The protagonist was a clever widow who solved cold cases. Somehow, that felt appropriate. Stephen's entreaties continued, cycling through his full repertoire of emotional manipulation. There was anger. You're being ridiculous? Guilt. After everything I've done for us. Gaslighting. You're obviously not thinking clearly. And finally, threats. You can't just cut me off, I have rights. Through it all, I sat quietly on my stairs, reading my book, letting each attempt at manipulation wash over me like waves against a rock. Each familiar tactic only confirmed what I now knew. This had never been about love. It had been about control, about access to my resources, about having someone reliable to fund his dreams, while he built a different life with someone else. At 7:45 p.m., Karen from next door pulled into her driveway. I heard Stephen's footsteps quickly retreat. He'd never liked witnesses to our private matters. Through my window, I watched him drive away in the luxury car I'd helped pay for, his taillights disappearing around the corner like the last embers of a fire I should have extinguished years ago. Only then did I open my door, finding a handful of red roses on the welcome mat, the same cheap variety he always bought when he needed quick forgiveness. I picked them up and walked straight to the compost bin, letting them fall among the coffee grounds and vegetable peelings. As I turned back to the house, Karen called over the fence. "Everything okay, Rose?" I looked at my neighbor, really looked at her, and found myself smiling. "No," I said honestly, "but it will be." The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I called in sick to work. Not for Stephen, not for an emergency, but for myself. Miss Rose Sullivan, the ever-reliable librarian who had never missed a shift unless someone else needed her, finally decided to need herself. I drove east out of Albuquerque, watching the Sandia Mountains grow larger in my windshield. The budget motel I chose was nothing special, just a clean room with crisp sheets and, most importantly, no history. No photographs of Stephen and me on the walls. No drawers full of his abandoned business plans. No echoes of promises that had turned out to be mirages. I sat cross-legged on the bed with my laptop, a fresh notebook, and the morning sun streaming through thin curtains. It was time to do what I did best: research, analyze, document. But this time, I wasn't investigating someone else's life or helping a student with their thesis. I was excavating my own buried self. The notebook's first entry was simple: things I stopped doing because of Stephen. The list grew quickly, each item a small revelation. Teaching evening literacy classes at the library. Stopped because Stephen said we needed me home for business dinners. My monthly book club. Gradually abandoned because Stephen's emergencies always seemed to coincide with meeting nights. The small vegetable garden Jorge and I had started. Left to wither because Stephen thought it made the yard look provincial. The next page. Things I want to start doing again. This list was harder, like flexing muscles that had atrophied, but slowly the items appeared. Plant tomatoes. Join the library's mystery readers circle. Take that ceramics class at the community center. Small dreams, perhaps, but they were mine. My phone buzzed. A text from Karen. "Brought you some soup. Left it by your back door. No need to talk. Just know you've got people in your corner." The tears came then, unexpected and cleansing. All these years, I'd thought I was choosing between love and loneliness. I hadn't realized there was a whole community of support right under my nose. People I'd kept at arm's length because Stephen had subtly convinced me that our problems should stay private, that only he could understand me, that only he could protect me from ending up alone. Around noon, my office phone rang, forwarded to my cell as always. It was Maria, one of our regular patrons, an elderly woman who came in every Wednesday to read the newspapers. "Miss Rose? Jenny at the desk?" Said you're sick. I just wanted to check if you need anything. You've helped me so many times with my grandson's research papers. I found myself telling her everything. Maria listened quietly, occasionally murmuring in understanding. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. You know, she finally said, my sister went through something similar. Want to know what she told me? She said the hardest part wasn't leaving. It was realizing how many people had been waiting to catch her when she finally jumped. After we hung up, I opened my email to find messages from 3 other library regulars. Word had gotten around that I was unwell, and each one offered help in their own way. Dr. Peterson, who spent his retirement reading medical journals in our reference section, offered to recommend a good therapist. Sarah, the college student I'd helped with her women's studies thesis, sent me a playlist titled Songs for Starting Over. Even Mr. Collins, our crotchety regular who complained about everything, had asked Jenny to tell me he hoped I'd stop letting that husband waste your talents. I looked at my reflection in the motel mirror, really looked at it. The woman staring back at me had silver in her hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Earned, not given. She had helped hundreds of people find the information they needed, guided countless students through research projects, created a space where knowledge and stories could flourish. She was not, and had never been, just someone's wife or someone's ATM. My laptop chimed with an email notification. Stephen, of course. The subject line read, Our Future. I moved it to a folder labeled Evidence without opening it. Instead, I opened a new document and began typing. Proposal for Adult Education. Program expansion. It was an idea I'd had years ago, but had never pursued, because Stephen said it would take too much time away from our goals. As the afternoon light shifted to evening, I ordered dinner from the motel's attached diner. A green chile cheeseburger, with extra fries, something Stephen would have called unnecessarily indulgent. I ate every bite, letting the spice burn away the last traces of guilt. That night, I slept better than I had in years, wrapped in cheap motel sheets that carried no memories. My dreams were full of library cards, garden tomatoes, and the sound of my own laughter, clear and free and belonging entirely to me. Coming home after those 2 days away felt like returning to a familiar book with new eyes. Every room held stories I could finally read clearly. The dining room where Stephen had pitched countless failed ventures over dinners I'd cooked. The study where I'd signed away pieces of my security one check at a time. The master bedroom where I'd lain awake wondering how to make ends meet while he slept soundly beside me. But today was about writing a new chapter. I pulled into my driveway just as the morning sun hit the front of the house, illuminating the faded blue paint job Stephen had always promised to refresh, but never had. Karen was already outside, watering her flower beds. Your car was gone, she said simply. I kept an eye on things. I nodded, touched by her quiet vigilance. The house looks different somehow. That's because you're seeing it with your own eyes now, not his. She set down her watering can. Need help carrying? Anything in? Together we brought in my overnight bag and a collection of supplies I'd bought on the way home. Paint samples, gardening tools, and a set of cobalt blue ceramic pots I'd fallen in love with at the garden center. Stephen would have called them frivolous. I called them a beginning. The house smelled stale, like endings and old compromises. I opened every window, letting the New Mexico breeze sweep through rooms that had held too many secrets for too long. In the kitchen, I found Karen's soup container, washed and waiting on the counter, along with a small potted herb garden, basil, thyme, and rosemary. I remembered you used to grow herbs, she said almost apologetically. Before before. I let someone else decide what belonged in my garden. I touched a fragrant basil leaf. Thank you. We spent the morning rearranging furniture, not in the careful way Stephen had insisted upon for his business gatherings, but in ways that made sense for me. My reading chair moved to the window where the light was best. The expensive but uncomfortable sofa he'd chosen went to the garage, replaced by the worn but cozy love seat from the guest room. Each change felt like a small declaration of independence. Around noon, I tackled his closet. The expensive suits hung there like empty versions of himself, each one purchased with money we couldn't afford. I carefully documented everything with my phone's camera, just as Lisa had advised, before boxing them up for donation. The space they left behind felt like a deep breath. In the back of my own closet, I found a box I'd almost forgotten about. Inside was my old leather jacket from my college days, a relic from before either marriage. I slipped it on. It still fit somehow. The woman in the mirror looked different wearing it now. Less like someone trying to recapture youth. More like someone reclaiming her own power. The doorbell rang at 2 p.m. My heart jumped, but it wasn't Stephen. It was Maria from the library, holding a paint roller and wearing old clothes. "Jenny mentioned you were redecorating," she said with a knowing smile. "I used to work in house painting before I retired. Thought you might want some expert help." By sunset, my bedroom walls were transformed from Stephen's preferred beige to a deep, peaceful blue that reminded me of summer twilight. Maria had shown me how to create a subtle texture effect that made the walls look like they held depths of color. We worked mostly in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by her practical tips or quiet words of encouragement. "Color is funny," she said as we cleaned our brushes. "People think it's just decoration, but it's really about claiming space. Every stroke you put on these walls is like signing your name." After Maria left, I sat in my reading chair watching the last light fade on my new blue walls. My phone showed 5 missed calls from Stephen and 3 emails with increasingly urgent subject lines. I left them unread and instead opened my photos, scrolling to a picture I'd taken that morning. The herb garden on my windowsill, green and full of promise. Something caught my eye outside the window. At the edge of my front yard, barely visible in the gathering dusk, was a small green shoot pushing up through the soil. I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. There, exactly where Jorge and I had planted them 20 years ago, tulip bulbs we'd thought long dead were sending up new growth. I knelt in the cool evening air, touching the tender shoot gently. All these years, they'd been waiting underground, biding their time through drought and neglect, holding on to the possibility of spring. I felt my throat tighten with unexpected recognition. Back inside, I opened my laptop and created a new document. At the top, I typed, "Garden Planning, Spring 2025. Below it, I began a list of everything I wanted to grow, everything I wanted to reclaim, everything I wanted to become. The cursor blinked steadily in the growing darkness, like a heartbeat, like hope, like permission to begin again. The Albuquerque Central Library had been my sanctuary for 3 decades, but walking through its doors that Monday morning felt different. I wasn't returning as Stephen's wife, the woman who worked extra shifts to fund someone else's dreams. I was returning as Just Rose, and I was surprised to find that Just Rose felt like more than enough. Jenny looked up from the circulation desk, her face brightening. "Welcome back. We missed you." She lowered her voice. Stephen came by on Friday looking for you. Said it was urgent." "I'm sure he did." I hung up my coat in the staff room. "If he comes again, please let security know he's not authorized to enter the building." Jenny's eyes widened slightly, but she just nodded. That's what I'd always loved about library people. They understood the sanctity of personal boundaries, the importance of quiet dignity. As I settled at my desk, I found a small envelope propped against my computer monitor. Inside was a card, signed by the entire staff, not with get-well wishes, but with something far more meaningful. "We see you, we support you, we're here." Each signature was accompanied by a book recommendation. Titles about women's empowerment, financial independence, and personal growth. My team of librarians doing what they did best, offering knowledge as a form of care. The morning passed in a comfortable routine of helping students, organizing research materials, and planning upcoming programs. Around 11, Dr. Peterson appeared at my desk, ostensibly to renew his medical journal subscriptions. "My friend Dr. Santos has an opening in her practice," he said casually, sliding a business card across my desk. "She specializes in helping people rebuild after financial abuse. Just in case you know anyone who might benefit." I tucked the card into my wallet, touched by his indirect kindness. "Thank you. I'm sure someone will find this very helpful." The real test came just before lunch. I was helping a young woman locate resources for her thesis on economic independence in modern marriages, an irony not lost on me, when I heard his voice at the front desk. "I need to speak with my wife," Stephen was saying to Jenny, his tone carrying that familiar mix of charm and authority that had once seemed so attractive. "It's a private family matter." I stepped out from behind the stacks, my heels clicking purposefully on the floor. "There are no private family matters anymore, Stephen. And this is my workplace." He turned, and I saw the moment he registered the change in me. Gone was his agreeable, accommodating Rose in sensible cardigans. Today I wore a crisp blue blazer and the silver pendant Jorge's mother had given me, salvaged from the safe deposit box. Small changes, but they felt like armor. "Rose, be reasonable," he started, his voice dropping to that intimate whisper he used for manipulation. "You're acting out of emotion. We need to discuss this like adults. No, what we need is for you to leave, voluntarily, or with security's assistance." My voice remained perfectly level, pitched at exactly the volume appropriate for a library. "Any communication can go through Lisa Martinez's office." His face darkened. "Lisa Martinez? You went to a lawyer?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "After everything I've done for you? I made you somebody, Rose. Before me, you were just a widow shelving books. A few years ago, those words would have cut deep. Now they just confirmed everything I'd realized in that motel room." I smiled, not unkindly. "No, Stephen. I was never just anything. And these books?" I gestured to the shelves around us. "They're not hiding places. They're gateways. Each one is a door to understanding, growth, and possibility. I didn't stay here because I couldn't be anything else. I stayed because this is where I help people find their own doors." Security arrived then, summoned discreetly by Jenny. As they escorted Stephen out, I heard him say something about community property and rights. I turned back to the young woman with the thesis, who had witnessed the entire exchange. "Sorry for the interruption," I said, returning to her research question. "Now, about economic independence in modern marriages, I believe I have some rather relevant sources for you." The rest of the day passed in a blur of productivity. I threw myself into planning the adult education program expansion I'd dreamed up in the motel. By closing time, I had a solid proposal drafted, complete with budget projections and community impact assessments. As I gathered my things to leave, I found one last surprise on my desk. A small potted African violet, its purple blooms bright, against dark leaves. The card read simply, "From the Tuesday morning reading circle. We always knew you had spine beneath those quiet leaves." I carried the plant to my car, its delicate flowers nodding in the evening breeze. In the reflection of my car window, I caught a glimpse of myself, straight-backed, clear-eyed, holding something small but fiercely alive. The woman in the reflection looked like someone who had finally found the right story to tell, and better yet, the courage to tell it. That evening, sitting at my newly positioned desk beside the window, I opened the folder I'd labeled Future. Inside were 3 documents that represented everything I'd been working on since that fateful morning. My expanded adult education proposal for the library, the paperwork for the Jorge Sullivan Scholarship Fund, and a detailed financial recovery plan. Lisa had helped me understand that rebuilding wasn't just about emotional healing. It required practical armor as well. I reviewed the steps we'd already taken, securing my accounts, documenting assets, and filing a formal separation agreement. The preliminary numbers were sobering, but not devastating. Without Stephen's constant emergencies draining my resources, my salary could actually support a comfortable, if modest, life. The Jorge Sullivan Scholarship Fund was my favorite part of the plan. The irony wasn't lost on me, using the money Stephen had tried to extract for his wine investment to help other women pursue their education instead. The fund would provide grants to women over 40 returning to college, women who, like me, might have put their own dreams on hold for someone else's. My phone buzzed with a text from Valerie, of all people. "We need to talk. Stephen's a mess. Can't we work something out?" I thought about the young woman I'd helped today with her thesis on economic independence, about the countless others who came to the library, seeking knowledge, escape, or just a quiet place to rebuild themselves. My reply was simple. "No, but I hope you've kept receipts." The adult education proposal was nearly finished. My vision was clear. Evening classes on financial literacy, workshops on recognizing emotional manipulation, seminars on starting over at any age. I'd already lined up 3 experts willing to teach pro bono, including a retired accountant who specialized in helping women untangle complicated marital finances. A soft knock at my door interrupted my planning. It was Karen, holding a fresh loaf of sourdough bread. "Thought you might like some company while you work," she said, settling into the comfortable reading chair I'd moved from the guest room. As we shared bread and tea, I showed her my plans. She listened intently, occasionally offering practical suggestions. When I mentioned the scholarship fund, her eyes grew bright. "You're not just rebuilding your life," she said. "You're creating a blueprint for others to build theirs." Looking around my study, at the walls now painted the deep blue of possibility, at the herb garden thriving on the windowsill, at the careful plans spread across my desk, I realized she was right. Every step I'd taken since that morning phone call had been both an ending and a beginning. Not just for me, but potentially for others too. I added one final item to my to-do list. Start memoir writing workshop at library. After all, every story of transformation deserves to be told, especially the quiet ones that happen in ordinary places like libraries, gardens, and suddenly peaceful homes. Some revolutions don't need manifestos or battle cries. Sometimes they just need a library card, a good friend with fresh bread, and the courage to write a new chapter. The first meeting of the New Chapter Book Club drew 12 women to the library's cozy reading room. I'd been careful with the name and description. Nothing that screamed self-help or divorce support. Just a simple invitation to discuss books about women's journeys of self-discovery, accompanied by coffee and Karen's now famous sourdough. Among the attendees was Eleanor, a regular patron I'd known for years. She'd always requested books on business management, explaining they were for her husband's consulting firm. Today, she clutched her copy of Financial Freedom After 50, with white knuckles, her wedding ring conspicuously absent. "I heard about what you did," she whispered as I poured her coffee. "About the scholarship fund, about standing up to Stephen." It made me realize, maybe I'm not too old to start over either. As we discussed the book, more stories emerged. Maria shared how she'd left an unfaithful husband in her 60s and put herself through accounting school. Sarah, our youngest member, spoke about breaking free from financial dependence on her controlling parents. Each story was different, yet familiar. Women discovering their worth wasn't measured by others' wallets or wishes. During a quiet moment, Jenny slipped in with an update. The Jorge Sullivan Scholarship Fund had received its first applications. 3 women, all over 40, all dreaming of completing degrees they'd abandoned for someone else's dreams. Reading their essays that evening would bring me to tears. Not of sadness, but of recognition. The following week, Dr. Santos's financial abuse recovery group began meeting in the library's private conference room. I'd helped arrange the space, ensuring discretion and comfort. Walking past that closed door every Tuesday, hearing the gentle murmur of voices inside, I felt a deep sense of rightness. The library had always been a place of transformation. Now it was becoming a sanctuary for metamorphosis. Stephen's attempts at contact had dwindled to occasional emails, each more businesslike than the last. Lisa assured me this was normal. The extinction burst of control, she called it. His last message was tellingly brief. "The Madrid deal fell through. Valerie left. Can we talk?" I archived it without responding. My garden needed attention. The tulips were blooming, their red petals bold against the freshly painted cobalt. Blue fence. Some transformations deserve your full attention. The library board approved my adult education proposal unanimously. "It's about time," the chairman said. Someone addressed these needs directly. As I outlined the curriculum, financial literacy, legal rights, personal empowerment, I saw heads nodding around the table. These weren't just classes. They were lifelines, disguised as lesson plans. That evening, looking out at my flourishing garden from my reading chair, I found myself smiling at the metaphor of it all. Every seed of change needs the right conditions to grow. Some water, some light, and most importantly, the courage to break through old soil toward new sky. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Filed the papers today. Thank you for showing me how." I added her name to my private list, not of victims or survivors, but of women who'd chosen to write their own stories. The list grew weekly, each name a reminder that sometimes the quietest revolutions leave the deepest marks. In helping others find their strength, I was discovering new depths of my own. Life has a way of coming full circle, I thought, watching a hummingbird visit my newly planted honeysuckle. 30 years ago, I'd chosen this career because I believed in the power of stories to change lives. I just hadn't realized then that sometimes the most important story you help write is someone else's path to freedom. The autumn morning Stephen made his final attempt to reclaim his power over me was, fittingly, during the library's first financial independence workshop. I was introducing our guest speaker, a forensic accountant specializing in hidden assets, when I saw him slip into the back row of the community room. He looked different, cheaper somehow, without the expensive suit and carefully maintained confidence. He sat quietly through the presentation, watching as the accountant explained how to track suspicious transactions and document financial abuse. I wondered if he recognized any of his own tactics in the PowerPoint slides. During the coffee break, he approached my desk. The old Stephen would have tried to charm or intimidate. This version just looked tired. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing to the workshop materials. "Building quite a movement here." "Not a movement," I corrected him. "Just a resource, like any other section in the library." He shifted uncomfortably, fingering the strap of what I recognized as his last designer briefcase. "Rose, I've been doing some thinking. About us. About what went wrong. I've changed. The thing with Valerie. It made me realize what really matters. 5 months ago, those words might have made my heart flutter with hope. Now they just sounded like what they were. Another script, another performance, another attempt to access a closed account. What matters, I said quietly, organizing the workshop handouts into neat piles, is that I finally checked out the right books. Did you know we have an excellent section on financial abuse? I've been building it lately. Very enlightening. This isn't you, Rose. All these workshops, these support groups. You're turning our private matters into some kind of crusade. The Rose I knew was more discreet. I looked up then, meeting his eyes directly. The Rose you knew was a character you created, a reliable ATM with a convenient fear of loneliness. But here's what you never understood about librarians, Stephen. We know that every book has multiple editions, and I finally published my own. He leaned forward, dropping his voice to that intimate whisper that once seemed so loving. I still own half of everything, you know. The house, the accounts, everything we built together. My lawyer says. Your lawyer, I interrupted calmly, should review my documentation. 30 years of receipts, Stephen. Every transfer, every loan, every time you used my inheritance to fund your schemes. I kept it all. Librarians are very good at archiving. The workshop participants were returning from their break. Eleanor caught my eye from the doorway, concern evident on her face. I gave her a reassuring smile. You know what the interesting thing about financial abuse is? I continued, gathering my presentation notes. It leaves a paper trail. Every betrayal, every manipulation, every broken promise has a receipt. The numbers tell the real story. Is that what I am to you now? Just another cautionary tale for your little support group. No, Stephen, you're a closed chapter. One I've finished reading and have no desire to revisit. He stood there for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for the old Rose to resurface. The one who would soften, who would put his needs first, who would give him one more chance. When she didn't appear, he turned to leave. The house looks different, he said at the door. That blue fence. It's not very practical. Neither am I anymore. I smiled genuinely. But I'm real, and that's worth so much more. After he left, Eleanor brought me a cup of tea. You okay? I took a sip, savoring the Earl Grey I no longer saved for special occasions. You know what? I really am. The afternoon sun slanted through the library, windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In the community room, women were sharing stories, trading advice, building bridges out of their own experiences. And I sat at my desk, surrounded by books and possibilities, finally the author of my own story. 6 months after that fateful phone call, I stood in front of the library's packed community room, preparing to announce the first recipients of the Jorge Sullivan Scholarship. The room buzzed with energy. Current applicants, past workshop participants, community supporters, and my ever-growing network of fierce, resilient women. The first scholarship winner was Patricia Martinez, a 52-year-old grandmother, returning to complete her teaching degree. As she accepted the certificate, her hands trembling slightly, she shared how she'd put her education on hold 30 years ago when her husband called it a selfish indulgence. "But here's what I learned in Rose's workshops," Patricia said, her voice growing stronger. "The most selfish thing you can do is bury your own light to make someone else shine. Today, I'm reclaiming my brightness." The second recipient, Monica Chen, had been attending our financial literacy classes for months. At 47, she was finally pursuing her business degree after divorcing a husband who had controlled every penny she earned. "My daughter is here today," she announced proudly. "I want her to see that it's never too late to rewrite your story." As I watched these women share their journeys, I thought about the quiet revolution that had started with a single overheard phone call. The Jorge Sullivan Scholarship Fund had grown beyond my initial vision, with local businesses and community members contributing to support women reclaiming their dreams. What had begun as my personal act of rebellion had become a beacon of hope for others. Karen, now the official baker for all library events, had set up a refreshment table featuring her signature sourdough and an array of treats made by workshop participants who'd rediscovered old passions. Eleanor, who'd finally left her controlling husband, was sharing her experience helping other women document their financial abuse cases. The library itself had transformed. Our adult education program had expanded to include weekly workshops on everything from budget management to emotional healing. The new chapter book club had spawned 3 sister groups, each focused on different aspects of personal growth and empowerment. Even the garden outside the library windows, once just decorative shrubs, now bloomed with herbs and flowers planted by our community. Dr. Santos had moved her support group permanently to the library, recognizing the power of healing in a place dedicated to knowledge and growth. "There's something symbolic," she told me, "about women rebuilding their lives, surrounded by stories of triumph and transformation." After the ceremony, as I was gathering my papers, I found a small package on my desk. Inside was a simple silver bookmark engraved with words from Maya Angelou. "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." The card was signed by the Tuesday morning reading circle. "Thank you for helping us tell our stories." Looking out at the sunset painting the Sandia Mountains in shades of pink and gold, I thought about how endings and beginnings often wear the same colors. My own story had sparked others, creating a chain reaction of women choosing themselves, their dreams, their worth. The library, always a sanctuary of stories, had become a launching pad for new narratives. That evening, as I tended to my thriving garden, tomatoes ripening on the vine, herbs spreading their fragrance in the cool air, tulips preparing to sleep until spring, I realized that this was what true wealth felt like. Not the kind Stephen had always chased, but the lasting richness of a life lived authentically, of helping others find their way back to themselves. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. The divorce papers were ready for final signing. Another ending, another beginning. I smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring more stories, more women finding their voices, more quiet revolutions, starting with a simple question. What if I chose myself this time? 1 year to the day after that fateful phone call about Napa Valley wines, I sat in my garden watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of promise. The cobalt blue fence had weathered beautifully. My herb garden was thriving, and the tulips Jorge and I had planted so long ago had multiplied, spreading hope across the flower beds in waves of red and gold. The final divorce papers had been signed last week, their weight lighter than I'd expected. Stephen had eventually agreed to a quiet settlement, perhaps finally understanding that my documented evidence of financial abuse left him little choice. Or maybe, in some small way, he'd recognized the justice in it. Either way, the house was mine now, free and clear, just like my heart. My phone buzzed with a morning text from Eleanor. "First day of business school. Scared but excited. Thank you for showing me the way." I smiled, remembering her transformation from timid library patron to confident student. She wasn't alone. The Jorge Sullivan Scholarship Fund had now helped 15 women return to school, each one carrying dreams that had been deferred but never forgotten. The library's transformation had exceeded even my optimistic plans. Our financial literacy and empowerment programs had become so popular that we'd had to expand to other branches across Albuquerque. Dr. Santos now had a waiting list for her support group, and Karen's Baking Through Recovery workshops had become a weekly celebration of healing and friendship. Yesterday, a young woman had approached my desk, clutching a worn copy of Financial Freedom After 50, the same book that had started our first book club. "My mother attended your workshops last spring," she said. "She left my father after 30 years of financial abuse. I just wanted you to know. You helped her find her voice. Now she's helping others find theirs." These ripples of change reminded me of something I had learned in my years among books. Stories have power not just in their telling, but in their ability to spark other stories. Each woman who found her strength became a lighthouse for others, illuminating paths that had seemed too dark to travel. The garden wind chimes Jorge's mother had given me tinkled in the morning breeze, another treasure reclaimed from my safe deposit box. Their melody mixed with the sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Karen watering her flowers, Maria's grandchildren leaving for school, the distant hum of a city learning to tell new stories. My own story wasn't just about leaving Stephen or reclaiming my finances. It was about discovering that the quiet librarian who had spent decades helping others find their stories had a powerful narrative of her own. Every small act of rebellion, painting a fence, planting a garden, starting a scholarship fund, had been a sentence in that story, spelling out a truth I'd finally learned. Love that demands your self-erasure isn't love at all. Tonight, I'll host another workshop at the library. More women will gather in that safe space, sharing their journeys, building their strength, learning to trust their own voices. Some will be taking their first tentative steps toward freedom. Others, celebrating milestones on their path to independence. Each of them carrying stories as unique as fingerprints, yet connected by a common thread of courage and resilience. But right now, in this peaceful morning moment, I sit in my garden surrounded by the flowers Jorge and I planted, the herbs I grew despite Stephen's dismissal, and the new blooms I've added to mark my renaissance. The sunrise catches the silver pendant at my throat. Not expensive, but chosen by me, for me. My reading chair, moved outside for morning contemplation, holds a stack of books I'm considering for next month's workshop. The breeze carries the scent of blooming honeysuckle, and I smile, remembering something I often tell the women in our support groups. Healing isn't always about grand gestures or dramatic escapes. Sometimes it's as quiet as a library, as steady as a garden growing, as simple as finally understanding that you were always enough, exactly as you are. I am Rose Sullivan, librarian, gardener, survivor, guide. My story isn't finished. It's just finally being written in my own hand, with my own words, on pages bound with freedom and possibility. And like the best books in my beloved library, it's here to help others find their way home to themselves. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Give me a like and comment below how the story seemed to you, See you in the next video.